Hi, I'm with the North Coast People's Alliance, and we'd like to know if you support Proposition 10. 10 includes, which would restore local control to cities and counties to create rent stabilization ordinances.
Okay.
Thank you.
First answer to John.
Okay, so I will be voting no on Proposition 10 because it makes it easier for cities and counties to pass rent control measures. Rent control measures are is something that sounds good at the beginning, and some people like it for a while. I have experience with rent control in my earlier days when I lived and worked in San Jose and South San Francisco. But what eventually happens is landlords are disincentivized to make repairs and maintenance on their properties because they can't afford to do it when rents are frozen. Other developers and builders are reluctant to build new apartments because they will fall under new rent control measures themselves. Now, 2 years ago, I did support, I think it was Measure W for the mobile home park rent control, because that was an entirely different matter. Mobile homes are owned by the individuals, and they rent space in the parks. And mobile homes mostly are not mobile. They can't move easily from one park to another. Also, Measure W had some protections in there for the park owners where they could make improvements, and with the consent of the mobile home owners, they could raise rents to pay for that. But otherwise, I'm opposed to rent control. It's a taking of private property. It makes landlords' properties less valuable and with no compensation from the government.
Okay, Jeanne?
So while by the way, I'm a renter as well. While rent control sounds great, what we really need is more rental units built in the state and in our city. I'm optimistic that the city of Eureka is changing our zoning laws to increase housing and density in our city. But the idea of rent control and why it doesn't work is because it removes the incentive from contractors and developers to receive a fair return on investment. If that's the case, it's counterproductive to creating more housing, because developers and contractors will take their money and go elsewhere with the money in order to receive a fair return on investment. I want to tell you something. So this month, and it was a shock to me, this month my rent went up $350 a month. I cried, but at the end of the day, I live in a great neighborhood. I love my neighbors. And after I was done crying, I acknowledged that my owner has the right for a fair return on investment so that he can continue investing in our community and offering housing. If we take that away from investors, and even small investors, then, that want to buy extra homes or mother-in-law units or anything else like that, it's going to reduce our housing in this community. Just as simple as that.
Natalie?
So I do support Proposition 10. It's going to go to you, the voters, so you get to make up your own minds about it. But I believe it would allow for the city of Eureka to have local control over this issue and give us more tools should we need them in the future. Because it's so linked to affordable housing, I also want to speak to ways to create more affordable housing. Some of these are to create incentives for the precious few developers who are in our area who build affordable housing projects to take on construction and management of larger supportive housing and affordable housing complexes. These would include pre-permitting of sites so they're ready to go with few barriers to construction, providing staff with technical assistance in the conceptual stage of the project, and creating a quicker process for LEED certified buildings, as well as identifying potential partners to help with provision of social services well in advance of projects. And I recently attended a housing forum in Fortuna where developers were invited to speak to what they would like to see from cities to encourage more development from their companies. And those were many of the things they listed, and they said that they want to keep those lines of communication open to decision makers and to city staff throughout the process so that they can just help problem solve as things come up. Allowing for much more infill development, like second units in backyards or above garages and upper story additions in commercial districts, will also allow for more housing to be built throughout town. The city of Eureka is largely built out, so the zoning code changes that we're going to be looking at, some have already been made, and some more comprehensive zoning code changes are going to be looked at before the end of this council's term. So I look forward to working on those and making it easier for people to really have control over the properties that they own and allow for creation of more housing.
Anthony?
So I'm going to echo a few comments that have already been said. Rent controls, they take the profit out of new housing. There's no way around it. One thing that hasn't been talked about yet, I won't just repeat all that. Again, we have a problem with slums in Eureka. 3 of them were boarded up by code enforcement and the Eureka Police's POP unit. And they were closed for good reason. There was a lot of drugs and bad stuff going on there. If you pass rent controls, and Prop 10 eventually leads to rent controls, let's just assume that's what you'll get. We have rent controls. You're going to have properties that were good turn really bad, and they will turn into slums because people that own property won't have the money to make improvements. They cannot make structural improvements. They can't improve the integrity of the house that you live in. And let's get this right. Rent controls, if you pass Prop 10, it will affect single homes. Since the 1960s, Eureka has been a suburban town with lots of suburbs, lots of single-family houses. Those are now going to be targeted if you pass Prop 10. That affects a lot of people in this room. Multifamily housing, forget about it. You will not have any new multifamily housing because there's no profit. This isn't just me trying to rip on something you don't like. This is basic economics. Basic economics, yes. So the deal is, if you want slums, eventually, vote for Prop 10. If you want housing shortages, vote for Prop 10. If you are like me and you care about union jobs, you care about jobs that actually produce a good paycheck, yes, I do actually, then you should not support Prop 10 because we need more housing, not less. Now I gotta tell you something, the infill thing is actually a good idea, except it's not good for the long term. Let's say, I went to the ADU fair, I learned a little bit. Let's say you find the means to have a separate little dwelling on your property so that you can have a relative or a mother-in-law or something come over. Well, you can't count that as a resident because 30 years from now, you're not gonna want a stranger living in some weird little building looking through your window. Let's be smart.
Hailey?
All right, so the basic economics is that Eureka is different than places like San Francisco and should have different rules. And I also want to assure landlords that if this proposition passes, that you will not be forced to charge less for rent than you're asking right now. It's not an overnight change. However, there will be more checks and balances going into the future about your decisions to raise rent of substantial amount on your tenants. I also want to say thank you guys for being here. We only have two or three more questions, but I can see it has been going on really long. But I want to say that yes, I do support California Proposition 10, the repeal of Costa-Hawkins. And I think that cities should have the abilities to make an impact on rent control. And also, something that wasn't mentioned before, is that it also included a banned vacancy control practice, which also affects our community greatly. So, yeah, that's what I've got to say. Thank you.
Leslie?
Yes, I support Prop 10. Yeah, and just to be clear, Prop 10 does not actually implement rent control. It just removes restrictions on localities deciding what they want to do for rent control, if they want to do anything. So just to be clear about that. Affordable rent is considered 30% or less of one's income, which is difficult to find in Humboldt County. One of my jobs is I support people who experience disabilities, among other things, and it's difficult. It's just difficult for people with limited incomes to find housing. So that's something I think to be honest about and know that we want people to be able to find housing that's good for them. Rent control does not mean that people can't profit off of housing. It just creates structures around how that profit grows over time. Though this area isn't like San Francisco, a lot of people I know moved to Eureka because they could afford it here, and that's a good thing. And I've seen, as an artist, many of my friends lose their homes in San Francisco and see the quality of life change tremendously in San Francisco. They can't actually find enough workers for the jobs they have there. And again, this is a different community, but it's good to look at what's happening statewide. And just having stabilized rent means that people have to move less and are better able to contribute to their neighborhood, which I think is a good thing. When people talk about, I don't know the people in my street, well, think about if you have people who can stay in their houses, you can know them, and you'll feel, a better sense of community on your streets.
Caroline?
No, I do not support Prop 10. I believe in the owner's ability to make a fair profit. I believe in capitalism and I am sorry, I have gnats all over the place, but I am really not swatting at myself. I believe in capitalism as I have previously stated. I would love to discuss with the property owners on some kind of program that we could work out to have them offer incentives or subsidies to lower their rental and commercial rental rates. But they would still end up with the same amount of rent at the end of the month. It's just the tenant themselves wouldn't have to bear the burden. So it sounds a lot like, well, might as well have rent control. No, there's the landlord or the property owner is still receiving their full rental rate. It's just the tenant doesn't have the burden of paying it all on their own. And there's a lot of money to be found to do that. On the other hand, I do believe there should be some common sense used to have a property owner not overcharge for their rental property. And that's a good example is looking at the Ritz. If it were worth as much as they wanted to rent it for, it would have been rented a long time ago and by many places. There's no way to regulate greed, but there's no reason someone can't make a living through renting their properties. But there's just, greed is what it is.
On behalf of the North Coast People's Alliance, Caroline Griffith will ask the next question, and Michelle will be the first one to respond.
Do you support California's Proposition 10, which would restore local control for cities and counties to create rent stabilization ordinances?
I do not support Prop 10 because while it may help in larger cities, I think it will hurt us here locally in Eureka. It will incentivize property owners and developers from creating more rental properties and maintaining the ones they currently have. And I don't believe that the government should be telling people what they should charge for their property. What we really need is more rentals in Eureka.
Heidi?
All right, well, economics are a matter of supply and demand. While I don't believe rent should be raised, allowed to be raised overnight and with no limits to rental amounts, I've also seen the effects of rent control, and what I've seen is actually really not pretty. Generally, over time, what happens is homeowners cannot maintain care for rentals and results in slum housing, which is not good for anyone. I do have concerns when it comes to what rent control and livable wage means. I mentioned that earlier, for the backs of those who seem to be carrying it, but I also believe in a city like Eureka, we have the ability to put into place reasonable laws that will care for every individual. Care for those who are renting, care for those who are owning rentals, and who need housing who can't afford housing, including mental health issues or some of these that really can't afford to work. And it would assist our citizens most effectively and probably more effectively, I believe, than Prop 10. But I do believe that we have to care and make sure that we are taking care of every single individual. And that is a much bigger question than just Prop 10. I think there are some unforeseen consequences that I've seen in the past with rent control that I would not like to see in our community, and that's some of my concerns about it.
Susan?
So I support the repeal of the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act, but only because blanket policies that cross the whole state don't always work. Sometimes Humboldt has been on the end where it doesn't work. Sometimes it's another community. So I always think that it's fair when communities can decide what they need to do themselves. That said, my housing priorities are to create more housing. That's really what we need. And we need to improve our substandard housing, which is a big issue right now. So rent control does not support those two ideas. There's a difference between affordable housing, which is a mandated kind of a government housing, and housing that is affordable. And what we need right now in Humboldt County is market rate housing. And we are trying so hard to get developers to develop, and they just are not. There's so many regulations, it's so expensive for them to develop that even by the time they build the first piece of a frame, they're already almost priced out of the housing, what they can charge for rent. And so we don't need to make it more difficult, but what we do need to do is we need to saturate. We need to put in infill wherever we can, which the city is working on ADU units and tiny houses. I'm working with the senior resource, or Area 1 on Aging to do a NEST program, which is home share. And I'm very interested in ways that people can get access to buying housing, like co-ops or smaller areas. So there's lots of things we can do to support housing, and it's a priority.
Joe?
I don't support Proposition 10. It's going to be counterproductive. Rent control is not just going to be a problem for a number of places to rent around here in the long run. It's going to be a very big problem in the very near short term. Rental availability will go down. I mean, how many of you have been here looking for an apartment in Eureka? It's kind of tough, huh? Especially if you have a dog or a cat. No new construction will occur, and this even allows rent control on houses also. So, you know, family houses. This is going to be a complete disaster. It's going to have a chilling effect on the market. Here again, you know, it's just going to kick the unions in the teeth again, because it's going to be bad for the construction trades, bad for unions, bad for real estate employees, bad for maintenance men, roofers, painters, and especially bad for people who are in that lower income area that don't fit into the affordable housing scenario. So that's it's just a bad deal. Now the council is already making plans to start up with rent control as soon as this passes. I mean, they'll pass rent control faster than Bob's your uncle. This will basically what this will do is this will completely throw into the ash can all the work that the city staff and planning department has done to try to make the central core area more dense with more apartments and places to live. That, you know, there's not going to be any more construction. Let me tell you that this is going to completely put an end to all this stuff. The whole idea of trying to put in ADUs, people are why do that? You're not going to be able to maintain them if you can't raise the rents over time to cover new roofs and new plumbing and new structural improvements. So, or even to rehab a place. So no, it's bad news.
Kim?
So I support local control, and that's the reason that I support this. I think it's really important for our city to be able to make their own decisions. I think blanket policies statewide have created problems for us. So I think each community should be able to decide for itself how to adjust rents and other items in our state.